In today's video, we are going to go through how to cut out the t-shirt for our doll clothes lesson. We are going to learn about sewing knits, and we are going to put part of the t-shirt together. Stay tuned and see how easy this is to do. Alright, so our first step, well, I did the first couple of steps because it's a repeat of last time. I cut out the individual pattern pieces for our shirt. Remember, we are making this long sleeve t-shirt here, and it's kind of a cool style. It's got a little yoke on it, and it's got some style to it. It's not a plain t-shirt, but I don't want to scare you with that. I want you to realize you can do this. You just take it slow and follow the directions, and follow my hints that I'm going to give you along the way. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the back pattern. Since the front has a seam, the front is actually two pieces. I'm going to take the back, I'm going to hold it up to the doll. And I like this length. I like the fact that this is a fairly long shirt. I tend to make my doll shirts longer. I like them better that way. So I have cut these pattern pieces out, and I have ironed them with a hot, dry iron. I've also ironed a section of this extra, I think it's a 2X, yeah, it's a 2X t-shirt. And like I said in the first episode of this series about sewing doll clothes, I love these because for a little over $3, I've got a massive amount of fabric to use. When t-shirts like this come on sale, and I know I'm going to be doing doll clothes, I purchase in the colors that I want to use the largest size I can find. White and black, typically stores will have extra, extra large. Some of the colors, they may only go up to large. So now I'm going to look at my pattern pieces. For our shirt, we have these pieces. We have a top back. We have a top front and a top yoke. This is the yoke front. We also have a neckband and a sleeve. Oh, I forgot to cut that. That little bit I will cut with these scissors, since my paper scissors are clear over on my desk. Now I want to apologize early on in this video because there may be a lot of background noise. Generally, this building I live in is fairly quiet. For some reason, my upstairs neighbor is really, really loud, and I've put off starting this video for about 3 hours waiting to see if he'd get quiet. He hasn't. I think he's shampooing his carpet, so he should be done because his apartment's no bigger than mine. He should be done by now. All right, so let's talk about laying out patterns on knits. So knits, typically you'll still have your grain line. You'll want your stretch going on most patterns across the body, just like it is on this t-shirt. Using a t-shirt, that makes it a little easier. All of these go just on the fabric except this one. You see this special arrow here? When you see an arrow where it's got two arrows with a little bracket, that means that you're putting it on the fold, and it says cut one on fold. So that means here. We don't have a seam. That's going to be the center front of your shirt. We're not going to use the hem today. I might show you a fun trick with that another time, but I'm going to get as much as I can right here. So I am going to pin this one right against the fold. Now when I folded this, I made sure that I was going so that it was straight. I made the fold on a nice straight area of the t-shirt. This is directly under the arm. And put enough pins in that your pattern piece will stay where you want it. Now we've got these other pieces. I am going to put this one right above it. Make sure you leave a little space because you need to cut it out and you don't want to clip into your pattern. Now, and you'll notice I'm not following the pattern directions for layout because they are assuming that I bought a piece of fabric at the fabric store. They're not assuming I'm using a t-shirt. So I'm just laying this on the way I know that it'll fit so that I can get my pattern pieces I want. to fit where I want them. Now this is kind of cool because you could do this yoke in a contrasting color. This is a neat shirt. You could do so many things to make it special. We won't do that on this one, although I'm pretty sure as I've planned this series out, sewing this shirt is going to take 2 weeks, and then I'm going to spend a 3rd week decorating the front of this shirt. I haven't decided how I'm going to do it. Now watch on your neckband, it's showing the arrow going that way. Make sure that's set the way it is. Now you could do this out of ribbing, and if I do this shirt pattern again, I might show you how to cut it out with the ribbing that's on the neck of the shirt. But today we're just going to use the t-shirt fabric like the pattern says. And here you'll notice it says stretch. It's showing you that's the direction the stretch needs to be on this pattern piece. Now we've got our yoke. And I'm not going to measure my arrows to the side because I'm pretty certain that I've got everything straight. If you feel uncomfortable and you're not sure if you've got them straight enough, go ahead and measure. It'll just take you an extra couple of seconds. It's better to be overly cautious than under cautious. Like that, and now the sleeve. And this is just going to be a plain white shirt. Well, probably put a design on the front. I'm kind of thinking about a couple of different things that I can show you to decorate the front of it that you won't have to have anything special to do, or not really anything that would be not something you could pick up anywhere. So now usually what I do is I'll cut my pattern piece area that I've pinned free from the rest of the shirt. So I just get kind of close to all my pattern pieces. I'm wasting a little fabric, but not very much. When I get to the point where I've got not much fabric left on this shirt, I'll actually even use the sleeves. Alright, now that's free. That's out of my way. I'll cut the first piece out, then I'm going to turn the camera off and cut the rest off camera. Just like our last one. Cut right along that pattern piece. And sometimes I cut them loosely. Excuse me, that way I can get in there and cut really easily. I hope the noise upstairs is not too loud. He's not nearly as loud as he was. Now it sounds like he's got his TV on, which is also unusual up there. All right, that one's cut out. I'm going to turn the camera off. I'm going to cut these out, and I'll be back. All right, so they're all cut out, and now I'm going to go through and I'm going to cut my notches out just like I showed you before. I'm going to do one different than what it says to. Get that. Get this one. I'm trying to make sure you guys can see and I can see. I know last week I had a lot of stuff off camera. I apologize for that. Now, we've got our regular notches. Again, you can tell which is the back of the sleeve because there's 2 notches instead of 1. There's always more notches on the back of something than the front. Now, there's a dot up here at the top of the sleeve. I don't mark that as a dot. What I do is I make a little clip. This dot matches where the top, front, and back come together. So it will match where the sleeve matches here. It will match this seam. So that is why I just do a little clip in there. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to cut all the rest of my notches, and then I'll be back. Alright, so I got all the notches cut out. It's actually the next day because the neighbor upstairs continued to be loud all day yesterday. So I didn't get anything done. So we are going to start sewing, but first we need to finish our markings. So yesterday afternoon, I cut all the notches out, and then I looked at our neckband piece. And there's some markings on here. I'm going to transfer some of them, but not with chalk today. I made a little clip where these two dots are, because those two dots are going to line up with our shoulder seam, just like the dot at the top of the sleeve. So I don't really need to mark that as a dot. The other ones, if you feel more comfortable marking them, go ahead and mark them just like we did before. But I know that I won't need to, because all this is it shows me to fold it in half and then to line it up with this seam on this piece. So I'm not going to mark those dots. So the next thing we need to do is we need to thread our machine with thread. I'm going to use white because this is a white t-shirt we're using. Change the needle from a woven needle to a knit needle. And then I cut off a sleeve off of the t-shirt. I recommend you cut off a piece because I want you to practice sewing on knit, especially if you've never sewn knit. It's a little different. It behaves a little differently than woven. It's a little more challenging, but you're up for it. So let me get the camera reoriented and get my thread changed and my needle changed, and we will talk about sewing on knit fabric. All right, I'm going to try this angle for a little bit, see if this works. I have put a knit appropriate needle in my sewing machine. I have rethreaded the bobbin and the top thread with white thread, and then it occurred to me I needed to show you what stitches look like that you want to use on a knit fabric. If you use a straight stitch like we used on the woven fabric, the threads are going to break when you stretch your fabric. So depending on your machine, I'm going to show you a really basic one first. This stitch here is just a zigzag. And I'm going to show you the zigzag as it comes up on my machine. This is just the normal zigzag. Now that will work on a knit, but to make a seam with it, I would adjust it a little bit. I would make it much narrower. You don't need that wide of a stitch. Probably there. And I would make it a little longer, because you don't need that. Just so it just barely goes back and forth. And it doesn't really show a lot, but it's not a straight stitch. I'd probably go a little bit wider than that, actually. Get it set so that's better. You'll have to play around with it and see how it works best on your machine. Now my machine actually has a stretch stitch, and I'm going to go back to that. And this is what that looks like. And this is what I will be using as we sew our t-shirt. This is the stitch I always use for knits. It's a little more compact than using the zigzag, and it just works a little better. Now let's get a piece of knit fabric, which, hold on, I have to grab. I forgot to pick it up. All right, now I've got a piece of knit. So I'm going to show you how this works. Actually, I'm just going to go over here. And I recommend that if you've never sewn with knits before, that you cut off like the sleeve or a chunk of the t-shirt or a chunk of your fabric you've purchased, and you practice sewing. Excuse me. Because it does feel different to sew knits. But I don't know how much the camera's picking up, but there's my seam. Now one thing I forgot to do, I'm going to make a mark. Because the knit stitch is always in the center of the foot. I can't put it over to the side like I do with for the other stitch. So I have lined up, I measured over 1/4 inch from this edge. And now I'm going to sew along that for a second just to make sure I'm lined up. There I go. Now I have a piece of masking tape sitting here. This is just regular masking tape like you would use when you're painting or whatever. I'm going to lay that on the bed of my machine. This won't hurt the machine, just be sure you take it off when you're done. But this way I've got this to sew up against. They make magnetic things that you can buy at the fabric store that you can do this with, but I've always just used the masking tape. Now I'm getting a little bit off because I'm looking at the camera and not at what I'm doing. But there we go. Now I have a 1/4 inch seam. I won't draw the line obviously when I'm sewing our garment, but for doing this, that helps. So let me move you probably to the side so that I can reach, well, maybe I can do you here. Let me check the pattern and I will get us set up to make our first seam. All right, I've got the camera kind of angled down, I've got the sewing machine pushed out of the way, and I've got you just on the table. We are going to sew the front yoke, or yoke front, to the top back at the shoulder seam. So we're going to unpin these 2 pieces. Now be sure that you check which is the right and the wrong side of your fabric. And you can tell the t-shirt, since we cut it as it was worn, the wrong sides are on the inside on this one. And we've got our yoke. Put that off to the side in a safe spot. Now always right sides together, and you're going to line up your armholes and your notches. This is the armhole side. This is the neckline side. Here's your notch. You notice your notch is not in the middle of the pattern piece. It's off to the side. It's off the side of the seam. Make sure you've got right sides together and pin, just like we did for the shorts. And again, I am pinning off the edge. I'm going to pin both pieces, making sure, again, the right side versus the wrong side of the fabric. And you can tell because it looks a little different. It looks more finished on the right side. All right, get that one done, and then match up your edges again. And pin. All right, I'm going to turn the camera off long enough to get my machine moved back, get us set up, and we will sew those seams. Oops. All right, now we're going to line up the edge of our fabric with the edge of the masking tape. It just gives me a straight spot to sew, and it lets me know where to sew from. We're going to move forward. And this stitch will go a little slower because it's going back and forth. And my fabric is not laying the way I want it to, so I'm going to do that. I could see it was kind of pushing my fabric where I didn't want it to be. And cut the thread. And we'll do the other one. Now I like to sew the same direction. So on these I'm starting at the center of the pattern and going towards the sleeve. And I'm not starting right at the very edge of my fabric for my seam because I don't want the feed dogs on my machine to eat up my fabric. And on this it's okay because we're going to cross the seam again. All right, and just like before, we need to move to the ironing board and iron this, so I'll meet you over there. All right, now we're going to press those seams. Oh, we're going to press the seam allowances open after we press them as sewn. But another check to make sure that you have mirror images. You've got a right and a left. So once again, I always press as sewn first. Then open up. I forgot to bring my little silicone finger with. I'll have to go find that before I press the next seam. Sometimes these little skinny seam allowances can be kind of a pain to get open. That's okay. We are patient. Looks like I didn't have my seam pinned quite where I wanted it, but it's fine. It's close enough. Now I'm going to press it from the right side of the fabric too, just to make sure it all looks good. All right, and I'm going to press the other one, and then I'll meet you at the sewing machine. All right, so our next step was actually to fold our neckbands in half, which I thought I filmed and I didn't. Basically, I just took the two pieces of fabric, wrong sides, each one wrong side together, and folded it so the right side is out, and we have these two pieces. Now, we're going to line these up with the neckline, which is right here. I'm going to trim off this extra piece of thread. These are our front and back, front yoke and back. Now, remember that little clip we made? I said was going to line up with the shoulder seam? That goes right here. Lines up right with that. And I pin. This needs to be stretched just a little bit. So line up the notch, and we'll have to hold it so it stretches while we sew it. So it's really important that you pin this really accurately. And this one again, and this one is cut. See how this is cut? This angle here lines up flat with the front center seam. It goes there. And this one, since I'm going to sew towards it, I'm going to actually pin that way. And now they're vacuuming the hallway outside. All right, let me turn the camera off to move the sewing machine forward, and we will sew this seam. All right, now this is one of the few places where I break my rule of always sewing the same direction, because I want to have this neckband up. And I am actually going to show you how to keep the machine from eating the fabric, because I want to start right at the end, and my machine's going to want to pull, these feed dogs are going to want to pull that narrow piece down. So I just cut a chunk off that's from the fabric, any fabric, it doesn't have to be the same fabric you're using. And I'm going to go so right to the edge. I'm going to raise my presser foot up, and I am going to line this one up right next to it. Now, I'm right up against this. It's not overlapping, it's right against it, and it's up against the masking tape. And now I can kind of pull with that. Hopefully you saw that. And you kind of want to pull, oops, keep that down. And I'm pulling the fabric through a little bit, because you do want everything to stretch to line up. And there, I don't like how that was pulling forward, so take that pin out. And now I need to get my fingers in here, and I need to hold this together until it goes underneath the presser foot. There we go. And there it is. That's our seam sewn, and it's stretched out to meet it. Now I just cut this off. Oops, cut off my little thing there and put it to the side. And I'm going to sew the other neckband seam, and then I'll meet you at the ironing board. All right, I'm going to do one of them on camera and the other one off, but there's our seam we just sewed. And we are going to, again, press as sewn. I can't emphasize that enough. I always do this. It's something I learned many years ago, and it just makes everything look better. Now, we are going to press this with our seam allowance towards the shirt. And then we're going to go for on the right side. And this is where you want to make sure that your iron and your ironing board are nice and clean, because you're using white fabric. Mine has stains, but it's not something that will come off. And there we go. So I'm going to sew the other, iron the other one, and then I'll meet you at the sewing machine. All right, we're back at the sewing machine, and now we need to sew this center front seam on our yoke. To do that, we're going to match up right here. We're going to peek inside that we've got everything lined up, because you want that seam to match. Otherwise, it's not going to look nice. It just takes an extra little minute, a little second really. And that's really all the pinning there is. Let's see if I can move the sewing machine back without turning the camera off. Angled back. Hopefully that worked. Find my little piece of fabric, because we definitely need it here, because we are going to be sewing a very small seam. Now this one we're going to want to make sure we finish off the top end. Don't worry about it too much down there. And I'm watching where my pin is in relationship to my needle. I'm going to take my pin out. And I'm actually going to do this a little differently than you might think. I'm going to rotate this. I want to sew backwards a little, just a few stitches, because the knotting off stitch on this stitch is just an up and down, which I am going to do. No, I'm not. Yeah, push the button to hold it. That will make a stitch in the same place. That. And we've got it sewn. Let's go over to the iron and press this seam, and then we'll do one more seam today. All right, let's press as sewn. I haven't looked to see how well I matched my seam. We'll see together after we press it. Now we're going to press the seam open. And this one, we might need to take a little hand stitch later just to make sure everything stays put, but it should stay just by pressing it. Let's look. How'd I do? And it matches. See how my seams come together there? Okay, let's go add the body front to the shirt, and then that's all we're going to do today. All right, so we've got that pressed. Let's take the pattern piece off our top front. I'm going to put that, oops, one more pin. Put that over. Oops, I didn't mean to put the pin over there. I meant to put the pattern piece over there. All right, now remember this fabric is done right sides out, and we want to match right side to right side. We've got a fold here that we can match up with our seam that we just did. And we've got notches to match. There's our notch. I'm going to put one more pin between those two. I'm going to put one here. Pin as many times in the seam as you feel you need to keep everything together. You don't want this to shift once you get it pinned before you sew it. Matching my notch. Put my edges together, make sure everything is lined up really nicely. And I'm going to do one more just to be sure. All right. Let's see if I can get my sewing machine back here. Get get you guys angled just a little bit differently than you are. Again, we're going to put our little piece of fabric in there. I'll try and get a picture of fabric lined up against this so that you guys can, and put it on the blog post so you can see it better. All right, let's get our pattern, our fabric. All right, once again, I am lining this up. And I'm going to go ahead and anchor my stitching at the front, which for this particular stitch on this machine means the needle goes up and down in the same hole a few times. I'm keeping pulling lightly on that little scrap of fabric I have at the end of my seam, just to keep everything moving, not hard. I don't want to stretch anything. I just want to keep the fabric moving through the presser foot. And let's see if I can manage to make sure everything is set up where it's supposed to be. I moved you, didn't I? Sorry about that. Let's get you moved back. Okay. I put a scrap of the t-shirt fabric down into the candle jar I've got the camera sitting on. I'm trying to fix the sound quality a little bit. I hope it worked, because I noticed when I've got you in front of me, it was really echoey. I think my voice was going down into the candle jar. I've got to find a short tripod that will hold my camera up. Make sure that you are catching just past that notch so you don't have a hole in your fabric showing. And that's our last one. Anchor stitch. And then I'm going to sew right off the edge. And cut my thread. All right, let's double check. First I'm going to cut off that our extra little pulling piece. And let's double check. If you don't get past your notch, like this notch is a little deep, I'm going to line my stitching up with my needle. And I'm going to take just a slightly wider seam allowance past this notch. It won't show, but just in case I was a little too close to the notch. All right, let's go over to the ironing board and iron this seam out. All right, once again, we are going to press this as sewn. I think it's going to be easier from this side. This is the third time I've tried to film this pressing the seam. I kept hitting the tripod with my iron. Now on this one, we aren't going to press it open. We're going to press the seam allowance down towards the body of the shirt, which means I need to turn it this way. How I would normally turn it and how I'm turning it with a tripod sitting right here are two entirely different things. Let's turn it right side out. And there we go. We have, except for the sleeve, we have our shirt pieces put together. So next week we will go ahead and put the sleeves on, do the hems and the side seams, and we will have a shirt by the end of next week. I hope you enjoyed this. Be sure and check the blog post for some photos, some more discussion. I'll talk about needles and different things, and I'll try to talk a little bit more about what stitches to choose for sewing knits. If you have any questions, be sure and ask me, and I will talk to you next week.